Just to kind of get a good idea of who's in the room, if you could raise your hand if you're a parent or caregiver, sorry, or a school professional, other professional in the room. Okay, great, both. Perfect. So the reason for this workshop and being able to put this information out is because oftentimes I would go into schools, and I'll kind of explain a little bit of my role too, but I go into schools and I talk to teachers and school personnel about how to support a child after a brain injury. And parents would come to me after and say, well, I want to go. I want to know that information too. That would be helpful for me to know. But the school setting and when I'm doing full school presentations, it's not always the best place because teachers want to ask questions about potentially other kids and things like that. So it's not always the right situation to have parents involved. So we really wanted to try to do more to get information out to parents, although the information is applicable to our school professionals as well. So we hope to do more of these throughout, maybe one closer into Denver, to make sure that we're reaching all of our families that really want the information. So I'm from the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado, and through our organization, we provide multiple services. I'm a specialized education consultation person, and with that, I provide support services to schools, to families, understanding how the school system can better support them, and then for schools, coming up with intervention ideas, helping at IEP meetings or transition meetings from hospitals. Really, whatever the school is wanting and whatever the family is wanting, I'm willing to do to support. So, like I mentioned, sometimes that's full school presentations and talking to all the teachers within a school because the child interfaces so much with so many different people, where they have multiple kids in the school who've had a brain injury. Other times, I'm sitting down with one or two teachers and we're problem solving this issue that they're having, this struggle that they're having, and we're trying to think about different interventions that can help them. So it can look all very, very different. But as our organization also provides case management services, among other things that you see here, workshops, rec programs, things like that. So in addition to me, anyone enrolled in our services has a case manager whose responsibility is navigating community resources with the so we work very closely, myself and the case manager, to make sure that if something comes up in my conversation with a parent that they could really support, I do that outreach and vice versa. Okay, so for the presentation today, we're going to talk about different types of brain injury. We're going to talk about school types of support. We're going to talk about some things that CDE has put out about neurocognitive building blocks, talk about intervention strategies. We'll hold on lots of different things. But feel free over online or in person if you have a question, just interrupt me, raise a hand, that'd be great. So our focus today primarily is our moderate to severe brain injuries. I'll talk a little bit about mild, but that's really where our focus will be for today. So under this big brain injury umbrella is the acquired brain injuries, and then we have anything pre-birth, the congenital injuries. So where I'm focused again is under these acquired brain injuries, both traumatic and non-traumatic. So anything that happens in utero prior to the birth of the child, for example, fetal alcohol, in utero stroke, things like that, would not be considered the acquired brain injury. So myself and our organization support anything that happens after birth, and those being the traumatic and non-traumatic injuries. But I think the important thing to remember is that they all have similar impacts and similar interventions are helpful. So here are some common non-traumatic injuries. I've been in this position since June, and I've been actually surprised how many strokes pediatric strokes are actually pretty popular. Anoxic injuries, I think, are also something that we see relatively often too, those non-traumatic injuries in childhood. And then our common causes of traumatic brain injury, and this gives the common causes per age there. You know, when I talk to schools, I often try to talk about this infant and toddler range a lot, which doesn't normally apply to them because they don't see the kids when they're that young, but they do see them several years down the road when they're in school, and when they show up in school, oftentimes have some big deficits and require a lot of support. So even though you don't see these kids immediately after their injury, you definitely see them in your schools, and these kids are struggling. They've had a TBI in those early years. Here's some statistics on brain injury, pointing out that the TBI is a leading cause of death and disability among our kids. I think sometimes, especially within schools, people think about it as a low incidence disability, so it doesn't happen very often. I've never had a child with a brain injury at my school. And usually I tell them, yeah, you probably have, you just probably didn't know about it. So this is maybe the first one that you know of. And then, you know, sometimes after a while things start clicking and other kids start coming to mind, and, you know, it gets kind of the things running. But oftentimes I get that in school, that, oh, this is our first child who's had a brain injury. And 40% of those in TBIs in the U.S. are in our pediatric population. And there's information there. CDC has a lot of stats they put out. So again, this is the TBI-related emergency department visits by age. And I know it's kind of hard to see, but that red line is way up top above all the rest. That's our 0 to 4 range. So again, I always make a big emphasis to schools when I talk to them that these kids have these major injuries, and you might not see them right away, but they're showing up at your school. So asking these questions about early injuries are really important for schools to consider. So why do schools miss these kids oftentimes? I think a lot of times things happen and parents don't necessarily think that that could be an issue. So if they're 3 years old and they get in a car accident, maybe they hit their head, or they hit their head and something happens, but everything seems to be going well after that from what they can tell at home. So it's oftentimes you don't even think about saying something to the school if they show up and they're having trouble with their learning or maybe some of the behaviors. So there's a lot of it that's just people aren't aware that they should mention things like that. But there's, you know, with that you have lack of awareness and lack of research and lack of trainings, and so it kind of perpetuates itself that we don't really hear about these kids as much as we should. And then you have lack of progress because you're trying to look at these kids the same way you would look at a child with a learning disability per se. And as you know, your kids are different than that and have different strengths and different deficits that aren't similar to other kids with other disabilities. So just to talk a little bit about, you know, if you have a child with a brain injury, who do you talk to? If it's immediately after an injury within the first month, oftentimes you are going to be usually connecting with a nurse. Maybe it's the school psychologist. Maybe it's their teacher who can kind of get things running. Maybe it's a special ed teacher, depending on the severity of the injury. The important thing is that you contact somebody. Even if it seems like it was relatively no big deal, maybe it was they spent a night or two in the hospital, it wasn't like this extensive rehab visit, it's always good to touch base with someone within the school to say, hey, this happened, this is what the doctor said, you know, just want to let you know, and they can help monitor things for you and support your understanding of whether that or how that brain injury is affecting them or whether or not it's having a long-term effect. And that's really with more mild or sometimes even moderate injuries. we don't get as much communication about. Those really severe injuries, when kids are extensively in rehab facilities and things, there usually tends to be a good transition back to the school, or someone at the hospital potentially contacting the school to get that conversation going. But as parents, you also are a huge part of that, and making sure that link is being made between the hospital and the school, because they often have great information they can provide to the school about how they're doing after the when you're talking months or years after an injury, it's kind of the same thing, starting with a classroom teacher, and now you're thinking back, oh, well, maybe that injury did have a bigger impact on their learning, and maybe that's something that I should bring up with the school. So starting with their teacher, maybe reaching out to an administrator there to kind of share some of your concerns. The nurse is always a great person. Again, the school psychologist within the school, depending on how much they're there, they kind of come and go a little more. But touch base with someone and start asking those questions, and they should be able to lead you to the person that will be most appropriate for you to talk to. But if you have that feeling like something's not right, it might or might not be related to this injury in the past, it's always good to just make a connection, start a conversation, and then we can go from there. Any questions so far in the room? Good. So and Rachel, feel free to jump in. If you have anything you want to say or contribute. So there's different types of supports offered in the school for our kids. Usually what they do, there's these I don't know if you've ever seen this pair, these triangles. They have the green at the bottom, the yellow in the middle, and the red at the top, right? RTI triangles, they used to call them. Now they're the MTSS, the multi-tiers of supports triangle. Basically, what that means is that every student is getting some sort of academic services universally, even social emotional services too, sometimes within the school. And then as their needs require it, they get more support, sort of work up to this yellow or red area within this nice little Colorado mountain that CDE, I think, was put out. But so when you're talking, it really evens out to sort of the type of injury that we're talking about. So when we're talking about more mild injuries, likely they need a few supports, accommodations, we call them in the schools, for a short amount of time. Maybe if it's a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury, it's something they might need for maybe a first month of recovery or a few months. And then those kind of fade away. When we're talking more moderate to severe injuries, we're talking about those more intensive levels of support, which are including 504 plans and special education services. And I'll talk a little bit about those. So you basically have several options of how you can get support for a child within the school. Does that all make sense? Questions about that? I think the goal in schools, really, just to go back for a second, is to give them as much as they need within general education courses first, and see if that's going to work. So that's why people start off with the interventions first and then work up. And then there's sometimes where, when you're talking about these severe injuries, the kids have been hospitalized for a week, you're surpassing all of that, and you're going right to the most intensive supports, because based on what they're showing you at that point, that's what they're going to need. You have to go through all of those processes. So this is just my short little bit on concussions here, mild traumatic brain injury. A concussion is a traumatic brain injury. The research now says about, depending on what research you say, about 70 to 90% recover within that first month, and about 95 to 97 recover within, or continue to have symptoms within that first year. So the outcomes are really generally good for kids who have, a concussion. There are short-term changes, so they're going to need some short-term interventions within the school. And we really decide what type of interventions they need based on the symptoms they're reporting and how that's showing up within that And then sometimes school districts will initiate a 504 plan at that point, which is a plan that really just gives accommodations, which are basically things like extra time on tests, or maybe it's a the fluctuation in their schedule for the short term while they're recovering, or some breaks, some cognitive breaks throughout the day to help with their fatigue, things like that. So these are just common signs and symptoms of concussion. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just knowing that having one of these symptoms does then follow with a diagnosis of concussion. And here's more popular accommodations. And these would, again, can be done, and some schools do without the use of a 504 plan. They'll use it as part of that MTSS, that first intervention, multi-tier support. But other times they'll write it in a more formalized document. And again, district to district, they kind of handle that differently. And child to child, that needs to be, kind of handled differently too. So something that we have conversations about, most appropriate. And then here's some other information that, if symptoms aren't resolving within 5 to 7 days, that they really should be receiving some specialized care. So I put that in there mainly to say that sometimes kids don't go to the doctor and see a doctor after these injuries. And so it's really important that they do. They have someone from the medical side monitoring things in conjunction with someone from the school side, showing you and telling you how they are presenting with it. But the full neuropsychological tests aren't usually recommended until you're 3 months out and until they are still helping them. And you want a lot of people involved in this team. So oftentimes you have, if it's an athlete, you'll have the athletic trainer, maybe potentially the nurse, but then you also probably have someone from the school, teacher, administrator, school psychologist, counselor, social worker, whoever it might be who's monitoring. And, helmets don't prevent concussion. So this is a little video I want to show you. It just kind of gives us some information of how our initial brains are built, just to give you a little background. Can you play?
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious, ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
So I play that because for several reasons. One, it gives you a nice introduction to what executive functioning is. As parents, you probably will hear people talk about in schools as something that's really impacted after a brain injury. Self-regulation is also one of those terms that you'll probably hear people mention in schools. And also that, you know, those experiences that they have prior to their injury can either help or hinder their growth after the injury. So we talk a lot about pre-existing conditions for kids, or what's going on with them before they have this injury. And oftentimes if it's a child who has maybe a diagnosis of ADHD prior to the injury, then we would expect that some of those attention concerns and some of those impulsive behaviors will be amplified and also be contributing to some of their struggles post-brain injury. Same with kids who have maybe a diagnosis of anxiety or depression or some other psychological diagnoses, learning disabilities, things like that. So when you hear people talk about executive functioning, and we'll go into it a little more, there's kind of these two peak times in our life when we're really developing a lot of these skills. And I feel like a lot of times people think about this high school age time and kids are really learning this. But I do want to point out again, like this 1 to 5 age time, that kids are also really engaged in that. So again, thinking about our young kids who've had injuries at a very young age, what skills that they're really focusing on at that point and trying to learn at that point. These are our self-regulation skills. Sharing and, you know, trying to teach them not to throw tantrums in the middle of a store, you know, whatever it might be that they're trying to learn at that point. So with brain injury, there's kind of these two stages, and this is, we're talking again, more moderate to severe injuries, that usually after these big injuries, there's a sharp decline in what they're able to do. Some kids, as you may have experienced, you know, lose the ability to walk or to talk and really communicate. And then those quickly start coming back through some rehabilitation, through things, and so you see this big spike of regaining a lot of those skills. And then after time, things kind of start to plateau a little bit. And they're not showing this rapid gain of information that they normally do. So if we don't do a lot of interventions, we kind of see this sort of stall out. But if we can continue to do interventions, and I don't have this slide with me, that we see that the cognitive stall actually move up farther down here. Because we've been able to get in there, provide the intervention support, and teach skills that will help them be successful. If we don't identify them and we don't get them the correct services, then unfortunately sometimes they don't get that same amount of growth and that opportunity to learn and develop. So this is Ron Savage had put out. It's actually at our brain injury conference we had last November. And it's just equating, because you'll oftentimes hear people say about brain injury that it's maybe a moving target. You never know what things are going to look like. But they can't ever tell you, based on the day of the injury or even a few months after, what things are going to be like 10, 15, 20 years down the road, 5 years down the road. So he put together this equation that just, because there's a few things that we need to consider and factor in when we're talking about what are those outcomes going to look like for kids. And that severity and type of brain injury is part of that. Obviously, we know if it's a more mild injury, it's likely not going to be impacting them long term. Age at the time of injury, pre-existing factors like I talked about before. And then I swore I fixed that slide researched it several times and it still showed up. Like this word I keep constantly. That I keep fixing, I swear, and then it misspells itself. So, not my fault. And then that combination of things is what really helps us predict outcomes for kids. Any questions about any of that? So when we think about age as a part of that equation, this is what I often talk to schools about is I want you to really consider 3 questions. So what age did the injury occur? What were the characteristics of development at that time? So what were they supposed to be learning at the time that they had their injury? Again, age, with super young kids, we're talking about self-regulation skills, being able to control their emotions, communication, things like that. So then you'll know where those disruptions might lie based on when that happens. And those are the skills that tend to be most vulnerable. Go. Yeah. So this is what CDE has put out. They have a brain injury manual on their website. If you Google CDE TBI, you'll get the link that pops up almost immediately on Google. And it has a pretty thorough manual on brain injury, on the development, based on age, sort of what potential concerns there might be, and then intervention ideas and things like that. They put out this building block hierarchy that really, in this bottom row here, this orange section, are our fundamental processes, meaning that we need all of these things to really be able to do the rest of them above. So, think of your child, think of a child at your school who maybe just even has some attention issues, potentially, and how that would affect them. Now, a child who's had a more moderate to severe injury likely has a few of those things impacting them. So it's going to be even harder for them to get really to that higher achieving level without really intervening on those major fundamental problems. So the idea is that, say, if we took out attention, the rest of these kind of fall. And so we can't expect that if they don't have those fundamental processes that without support that they're going to be successful. So we're going to go into all of these different ones now, and I try to simplify it to kind of give you a definition of, okay. A definition of what these mean, because you'll hear these terms in schools oftentimes, and then what's one thing you can do at home, and what's one thing that you could come to the school with as a recommendation. And again, if you're seeing these in your child or in your student, because not all of these are going to probably affect your child. So just being really purposeful on the intervention and support that we get. So processing speed is simply just how quickly we are processing information. In schools, they do that a lot through reading fluency. Let's talk to you about our math fluency. How quickly they're reading can sometimes give you a good idea. But you'll recognize it in the way that they're speaking to you, essentially. How long do they have to take time to think about what they want to say before they say it? You give them a direction, and it takes them a while to really understand, even if it's go get your backpack, we're leaving for school. How long does it take for them to think about what you said and being able to follow through with that action? How quickly is that information being processed? You can also notice it a lot in sometimes how they talk too, if they're slower to respond to your questions or in conversation. So at home, giving directions one at a time. Just a simple thing that you can do at home that you won't get frustrated and say, well, I asked you to clean your room and put your clothes away and fold the laundry, and you only did one. So then, and likely they're not capable of essentially understanding and remembering all of those things you said because you said it so quickly, you were probably frustrated when you said it, and they can't remember all of them, but maybe they got one of them, and that's the one they did. So this will save you, I think, a lot of stress too by just knowing, okay, I'll do one thing at a time. You can also support with different, if you have a list of things you want them to do, you hand that to them to make sure they follow through depending on their age and what you feel like you can expect from them. And school, just simplifying their language, focusing on the most important parts because they're going to miss, just tell them what they need to know. You over talk to these kids, then you're going to lose them and they won't be able to follow. Yeah.
I work in an emergency school. I think that is with the student had a concussion and they have the language as well. They're in an emergency class and have concussion.
So and they're having trouble, difficulty processing information.
Yeah, they have trouble with one-step things right now.
Yeah. Then while you're doing things one at a time, if you can match even a visual potentially with what your expectation is, if you give them sort of a reference point that you can check back to make sure that they've done what you've asked them to do.
Do you think it's best if they're out of the emergency class during their recovery, or does it matter really?
Well, it depends on the expectations of that class and how much they can keep up with that. I'd say if you're talking a more mild injury, then I think that it's maybe something that could be temporarily looked at, but I think the accommodations can likely be made still within the classroom to provide the support so they're not missing that classroom time.
Did you get teacher questions? Did you repeat them?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
That's okay, I typed it.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions on processing speed and what that means and anything? So attention. So the good thing to know about attention is there's lots of different kinds of attention. And so your child or your student might struggle in one area but not another. So then I listed those right there. The selective attention means that you can, being able to focus on one thing when there's, other things going on within the room, which tends to be really difficult, I think, for our kids with brain injury, that someone's talking next to them and then there goes their attention, or someone walks in the door, someone sharpening a pencil. It can all be very school-related, innocent things. It doesn't have to be anything too loud, but, someone next to them tapping their pencil, things like that, that would just, make them move their attention. And then another big thing that comes up is being able to shift attention from task to task, from going from one thing to the next. And really being able to give that your full attention. So a good home intervention is just really organizing the work time. I have 15 minutes on for 2 minutes off on this, but at the level of your child. If they can't focus for 15 minutes, don't start with 15 minutes. Start with what you believe that they can do. And remembering that at home, they've been working so hard all day. They're probably extra fatigued and extra exhausted, that it might need to be shortened because of that too. That maybe in school they could do more, but by the time they get home, it's just too much. And then same intervention for school I've seen work very successfully, really organizing it. Sensory processing is really how we process our senses. Our hearing, the smell, taste, touch, all of those things. So some kids are very sensitive to touch that would seem almost insignificant to you, or the touch of certain clothing on their skin and it drives them crazy. Or sounds are really sensitive to the sounds of an assembly, for example, or a athletic event at their school, or a prom that season. I know it just passed. Those types of things are really sensitive to those, and those kind of tend to heighten some maybe other symptoms of headache. So these are some ideas that I put out there, but it's all specific to what is this actual sensory system that is struggling. Okay, so if you're having trouble with sound, then you're not going to do heavy work and play activities. That was more specific to if you're really needing some input into your body. So that was just specific. But the best person for you to really get information on, so what sensory system, if any, is impacted, and what do I do about it, is going to be your OT and your school system. They're really a great resource for you. Your school psychologist would be great to help you figure that out too. Or outside OTs, I'm sure can support that if your child's seeing someone like that. But it's important to make sure you're targeting the right area. That was just an example. This is just a funny little video about sensory processing and how it sort of affects our thinking.
I need to close the program real quick so it stops interrupting. Apologize. Sorry, everybody.
Freak out about the DVD. Here's what that means. Don't fixate on it. Don't wake me up in the middle of the night or nag me through the door while I'm on the toilet.
Hey, first, talking to you while you're on the toilet isn't exactly a picnic for me either. You remember, when you can hear me, I can hear you. And second, you completely disregard how uncomfortable unresolved issues are for me. It's like an itch in my brain I can't scratch.
When I broke my arm, I used to stick a coat hanger down there. Gonna try that? Maybe go into the ear.
You wouldn't make jokes if you could feel the way I feel.
Well, I don't know how to do that.
How about this? I promise I won't pester you about the DVD. You can defecate in peace. That's a win for both of us. But until this matter is resolved, I would like you to wear this sweater with nothing underneath it.
That's stupid. Why?
You say it's itchy and uncomfortable. I say situations like this make me feel the same way.
I'm telling you, try the hanger.
Put it on. Let's share the experience.
You got it. If this sweater shuts you up, I'm going to make a fortune selling them to everyone we know. Now, all I need to do is head down to the video store and return the DVD.
Oh, did I forget to tell you? That store went out of business years ago.
Really?
How those nipples feeling, Chief?
So just a funny way to kind of remember that that those things that are invisible to us that we can't see, but we know kids are experiencing, are really affecting them in the classroom in ways that they probably can't explain to you, as well as sometimes in particular some big things here. But moving on to language processes, and I think receptive language is understanding language, expressive language is being able to speak language. But one thing I feel like I talk to schools a lot about are these social pragmatics, because I think the other ones are pretty obvious. If you work with a speech-language pathologist, they can actually assess all of these things. But you probably would notice some of those receptive and expressive concerns. The social pragmatics are really the understanding and being able to read those verbal and nonverbal social cues. And this gets, I think, our kids who've had a brain injury in a lot of trouble because they misread social situations, sometimes between teachers, themselves and teachers, sometimes maybe between you and them, parent, caregiver and them, as well as kids. And perception is everything. So how they are seeing those interactions, whether or not you feel or the teacher feels like that's how things happen, mean everything to them. So really working on and making sure we're having a good grasp on, do they understand a lot of those social cues that are going to help them navigate friendships and relationships with really anyone in their life. So then there's some interventions that I've listed there. Depending on what area they're struggling with, again, depends on what you might recommend. But again, these are all, many of these are pulled from the CBE manual out there too. So if you want more ideas, there's plenty more within that. These are just a few to kind of get you through. Any questions about that? Okay, so again, when we talk about kids with brain injury, oftentimes they, in some cases, are able to regain a lot of the information that they had learned previously. Sometimes in a hospital setting, might say that this is cognitive reserve. So it's everything that they've learned prior to the point where they had that injury. Those things, oftentimes for kids, sometimes for kids tend to come back for them, not always. But it's that new learning. So sometimes kids will come back to school immediately after, and they'll do some testing and say, wow, they're exactly sort of at grade level where they left off. They've made this fabulous recovery so far. But then they start learning new concepts and things are starting to fall. So knowing that just because they come back from their injury and things are looking pretty good and they might be on grade level, doesn't mean we stop tracking and monitoring and watching these kids to make sure that those impacts on the new information that they've learned, can they retain that information and to the same level they were before is really an important thing. So just with learning processes in general, and this is a good memory strategy too, is if when you see your child at home doing homework, ask them to tell you about what the expectations are. Maybe they can't. That might be a possibility that they can't. And then you'll know right off the bat that they're never going to finish that homework. That they're not going to be doing that. And the teacher's probably going to call you and tell you that they're not finishing their homework, and that might impact grades and other things. But that's a big cue for you. If they can tell you about their homework, that gives them a good chance to sort of relearn it and reteach it to you. And then you'll get a good grasp of how well they are understanding it too. It helps you as a parent stay a little more involved in, are they really getting what's happening in the classroom? And then for the school, outlining and highlighting some of the most important concepts, really linking whatever they're learning to real world experiences or things that they've experienced before. if you can link things into the level of interest that they have, those are all going to be important strategies to help them with that new learning. So then they have a link to something they already know, helps with students. Visual spatial processing is another big one you might hear. It's how well kids can see and understand visual information. A lot of times this translates into a lot of math skills. There is one family that I've worked with quite closely where her visual spatial skills are exactly what they were or exactly what they are as a teenager. It should be average range completely. But her verbal skills, her ability to communicate, to read and write, are much, much lower than they were before. And what you see oftentimes as a struggle, I'm sure you guys have seen too, with her brain injury, is that when there's these big gaps, people might just assume one or the other. They may just assume however she can communicate verbally is how she can think across the board, or her intelligence across the board, her abilities across the board. Well, that's not true with our kids with brain injury because we know that so many of their skills are scattered. So although it's not very obvious that her visual spatial skills are on par, and you see that in her artwork, and you can see it in so many other things, that because school is such a verbal environment and you're required to do so much of that, obviously reading and writing and communication, that sometimes that can get sidelined and people can only see that deficit and sort of forget that she also has these quite amazing skills in this other area. But if that's a problem, recognizing visuals, sometimes kids will have, they have any visual impairments as a result of their injury, which would likely be an issue for them too. The kids that I've seen who have some issues with visual processing, they bump into kids a lot, or not really recognize their body in space, and that gets them in a lot of trouble in school because they look like they're being aggressive or trying to fight with other kids, and other kids are reading that in a different way too. But really, they're not able to recognize their body in space compared to somebody else. And then it might even come up in sort of how they're being able to see the reading and writing. So maybe they can read just fine. It's just the print is too small for them. So they need less on a page and they need that print to be bigger. So maybe reducing the amount of that. On math problems, they can't follow it because they sort of start doing this as they trail off and try to solve longer algebra equations. So making sure things are lined up for them and organized for them and help them recognize all those details that are required. So I want to go into executive functioning a little bit, so maybe we'll start a little bit with that and then we'll take a little break. Okay? Cookie break is probably necessary. Sorry for anyone online who don't have their cookies. So executive functioning is basically, like the video said, it's our air traffic control system, how we intentionally solve problems, how we create goals and follow through with them, our working memory, our planning, and our organization. It's what, as adults, makes us successful, really, in our job. How do you executive function? This is really how we think, act, and solve problems. These are different words you'll hear associated with executive functioning. I'm going to talk about some of them, or most of them today. So when you hear people say executive function in schools, they could be talking about any number of these things. So it's a general term that's usually thrown out. What's important is to focus on, well, which parts of executive functioning are a concern. Because it might not be all of them, it might be most of them, but sometimes people will say, well, they'll write a goal, for example, on executive functioning skills. Well, be more specific. What is it? Is it organization that you want to work on? Is it the starting of a task or initiation? The important thing is just to be very specific. So working memory is quite a complicated and multi-dimensional process. But working memory is really the focus in our executive functioning. So holding information, manipulating it in our brain, and being able to spit it out or give some information after that. But we also have visual processing, so how well we can, or visual memory, how well we can remember visual details or visual pictures, how well we can remember things when they're just told to us. Short-term memory, long-term memory, how well we remember facts. Some kids are great at remembering certain facts, but things that are more abstract, very difficult for them. Yeah, and then the long-term. So those are the big ones. The big thing with memory, I think, is that a lot of us have trouble with one part of memory or another. Usually, some of us are more visual learners or need to hear things. A lot of kids like to hear things read to them. It's easier for them to understand it if they read it themselves. So I think the important thing is that if you link them together, if you link the visual supports with the auditory supports, you're going to win much more often than if you try to just do one or another. And depending on the age of your child or the student, the class determined, or the age sort of determined what that presentation looks like. So as they're in high school, they're oftentimes given just more auditory information, maybe less visual information. In elementary schools, a lot of times they have a visual schedule already up that explains what their day is, and teachers might be going over that with them and reviewing that with them. So knowing the school environment, the classroom environment is going to help you too. But then using those strategies that you know will help to get the teachers to support them. And then some home interventions, just creating some checklists and routines. You can have your own visual schedule. Sometimes if getting ready in the morning is the hardest thing to do, and you feel like every day you're reminding them the same thing over and over and over again, create a visual schedule for them. So they can, have a picture of brushing their teeth, and so then they can put a Velcro, move it over when they're done. Then they get dressed. Then they have breakfast. Then they get their backpack, put their shoes on, they're ready to go. Anything that's going to also take more off of your plate to do every morning and help build their independence. Now they're being able to do all those things on their own. But if you just give them a list of things that they need to do that day or that morning and expect them to follow through, if they're having trouble with auditory memory, they're not going to be able to follow through. So you're really just setting them up to be more successful. And in school, you're breaking things down one piece at a time. Also, one thing that helps is sometimes just even trying to copy something from the board to a piece of paper, like some of you are doing now, is going to be really difficult for kids to remember everything they need to have included to get it done here. So the teacher can just put whatever is on the board, whatever example that is, right next to them and transfer like this. It's a lot easier. And this is just a little thing that I put up for teachers. And it says, the kids don't listen, so I have to repeat myself. I'm always repeating myself. Always saying the same thing more than once. I say it once, and then they make me say it again. I think this is probably pretty true about most parents. Most parents feel in the room, too. So you're not alone. You and teachers feel the same way. And inhibition. So this is the ability to hold back your impulses. It's our filter, sometimes verbally. Or think before we act. Sometimes our kids with brain injury have a hard time with the filter and not saying everything they think and see when they see it. And unfortunately, that can upset teachers sometimes and administrators and other people, especially if those things aren't very kind. And so I do a lot of communication with them about most of us might be thinking some things, but we don't say them because we want to keep our jobs or keep our friendships or maintain our relationships. But thinking them is part of who we are, right? We're emotional people. We get upset, and that's okay. But these kids are just letting it out. So helping to really support them in being so impulsive and maybe some of those verbal actions and then also those physical actions that tend to get kids in trouble too quite a bit. Standing up and just walking out of the classroom. You know, getting really excited at a recess time and running up to their friends and maybe being too forward with them, and you know, then again looking aggressive. They're just not able to control things. Reasoning. This is a big one when we talk about social problem solving too, and being able to know how to navigate social situations. So when I think about kids who have some reasoning difficulties, is they might just go along with what other people are saying or doing because they're not thinking through the consequences of that. Or they might just go ahead and react and not be thinking through the consequences of that. And where this becomes really frustrating with people in schools too is that, and I'm sure you at home, is that after the fact, they can tell you what the consequence was, they can tell you what they did wrong, they can tell you, you know, exactly what they should have done in the place of that, but in the moment, they're not doing it. Because it's hard, especially with some impulsivity too, it's hard to really control and do that reasoning independently when they're in the moment. And that can be really frustrating, I know, from a home and school. So really talking through different choices and giving kids the independence to make those choices, but just talk through it with them. Well, what if you made this choice? What would happen after that? What do you think? Well, what if it was this choice? What would happen after that? And then give them the independence to think through, okay, well, now I know what those sort of look like. Now I can make a decision. And the more you practice that, the more that becomes a little more ingrained. And just having those conversations after the fact, although they can tell you all those things, it doesn't hurt because then they can sort of remember next time. These are both pretty similar. So this is kind of an example. So especially when working with other kids, and this kind of goes into kids who have trouble with planning too, that, okay, you're setting a goal. And your goal might be to write 5 sentences today for your writing prompt. And the obstacle is whatever it might be. You're tired, your hand hurts, you don't have a pencil, or whatever it might be. So then what are you going to do about it? Well, I'm going to tell the teacher. Well, what if the teacher is not available? Well, then I'm going to ask one of the people next to me. Okay, well, what if they're busy working and they're not helping you? So think through, well, what do you do if plan A doesn't work? Sometimes it really stumps kids. And this gets into more planning too. There was a child in a school that I was working with who he never got started on his work. He was never finishing his work. And so it was really frustrating because they felt he was capable of doing it, but he wouldn't complete anything. So the teacher had nothing to show for what this child was capable of doing. The family was frustrated because they weren't able to see any of the work output. And what it came down to after a lot of investigation and trial and error is that he never had a sharpened pencil available to him in his desk. There were pencils in the room. The teacher had a little spot that had all the sharpened pencils. But he would look in his desk, and his pencil would be chipped off, and then that was it. He couldn't do his work. And so he would sit there, or he'd talk to other friends in the class, and then likely maybe get into some trouble. But that's all really it was. As long as they provided him a pencil immediately, then all of a sudden he was able to start his work and get that done. But he knew all, all the options have been taught to him. Raise your hand. But that was just, he stopped at that level. So really reinforcing things like that, it can be so simple sometimes. But completely unable to get anything done just because of that small little thing that most of us would think, well, there's a million options. It's a classroom. Go look around, Or maybe then they're taking one from the neighbor, from their peer's desk, and that never goes over well either. So I'll go over this one, and then we'll take a quick little break. So mental flexibility is shifting from one activity or another, one thought to another. Sometimes it's just going from a lecture type teacher presenting in the front of the class to doing independent work. Sometimes it's center rotations in an elementary school. Sometimes it's just that someone else kind of walks in the room and takes your attention and then getting back to what you were doing before in classroom. Classroom to classroom after lunch or recess. That's a big time. And then especially if they're in sort of stressful situations. And you can kind of work with school. You probably know and can identify what. And the type shifting and the types of questions in school, that's a big one too. Going from multiple choice to short answer or back and forth between the two can be enough to really fit. So there's going to be another video.
Mm-hmm.
This is the last one.
Do you want to watch it or do you want to take a break first?
Let's watch the video and then we'll take a quick break. Oh, is it better if we don't?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Again, just a funny way to look at mental flexibility.
Oh, that's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. Already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are two people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something?
Help!
I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me. Well, enough left to do. Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second. He said he could fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. Says he can fix it.
So again, I joke, but I mean that's sometimes how it might appear, and you're thinking to yourself, well, how do they not know just to go and just do this, walk up the escalator? You know, there's a step right in front of you, but that takes a lot of executive function sometimes, and kids get a little stunted. Another student I was observing was in a classroom, and they, their routine changed. And all the kids were taking the test, but this student wasn't required to. And so they just sat there and they didn't know what was done next. Luckily, the teacher knew enough to get everyone settled and come over. But I do question how long the student would have sat there before, and not be disruptive, not do anything wrong. They're being very, polite and quiet and respectful of everyone's, time, but just not do anything about it. Not raise a hand and say, what would you like me to do? So sometimes it's very simple things like that. So we'll take a little break and you guys can get a drink, have some more snacks, maybe for about, 5-10 minutes or so. We'll see. I mean, we all do. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to move through kind of the rest of these executive functions because I want to have a chance at the end for people to ask questions and maybe even share some of their own experiences too. So planning we kind of talked about too, with step-by-step directions, and I'm going to move through this. But this is kind of just a funny little cartoon here. Problems often look overwhelming at first. The secret is to break problems into small, manageable chunks. If you deal with those, then you're done before you know it. For example, I'm supposed to read this entire history tablet. It's impossible, so I break the problem down. You focus on reading the first section. I ask myself, do I even care? And I feel like that very much applies to kids often. Here's organization, and the one thing I just want to point out about organization is we think about organization of materials a lot. Maybe their rooms super messy, so it might look like this in your house, or your classroom might look like that. But organization of thoughts is a big thing that impacts kids with brain injury. So sometimes you'll get the response of, I don't know, or I don't care, or these short little responses because trying to think and organize what they're really wanting to say in their brain is really, really difficult. So providing the support with them to really get out what they're feeling, what they're thinking, maybe what their frustrations are really, really important. So it's not just about their physical environment. Initiation is getting started with things. So some kids just need that push to get started, and then they're good to go and they can keep working. But if they don't get started, they're never going to get it done. So people think work completion all the time, that they never finish their work. And I always ask, well, how long does it take them to get started in their work? And that kind of tells you a lot. The teacher gives instructions, and then 5 minutes later, your child's still not doing anything, or maybe they're still walking around the room because of the mental flexibility concerns, and then they kind of get settled a little later. Well, then they've either missed the instruction or they missed a lot of work time that they can't obviously make up to. Mr. Jessup says, I'm not procrastinating. I'm proactively delaying the implementation of the energy-intensive phase of the project until the enthusiasm factor that is maximum effectiveness. So, if that's the case in school, then oftentimes kids might not ever get anything done. They don't always feel enthusiastic about everything they're working on, nor do we in our lives either, right? If we waited for us to feel excited about something, we might never get anything done. Okay. There we go. And then social emotional competency or emotional regulation. So this is is multifaceted, but it's really how well they can engage with other people, how well they can sort of regulate their own emotions if they get upset. What are those reactions? Are they over the top? Even if, from your perspective, they seem like very small things that really, you wouldn't think would upset them. But a huge part of this is also their own monitoring. And one thing that's pretty apparent sometimes for kids after brain injury, they don't really, especially initially, have a good grasp on how their behaviors have changed or how that's now impacting their learning, their social interactions, those types of things. So this awareness of how they're now acting when they feel like maybe they're somewhat similar than they were before. And then you're the eyes saying, no, this is really sort of different than things used to be. So just talking to a child about what their experience is, without talking to other members of the team, the teachers, the parents, and all those things, we don't always get a good idea of what the child's actually experiencing too, because of their ability to self-monitor. That's also then, part of that controlling their behaviors. I think one of the biggest things is that parents and teachers, again, when there are behavior issues, in quotes, or there's something going on with the school, that the collaboration between the school and the home is essential. Because sometimes kids will come home and say to parents, well, this, and this happened, because from their perspective, that's exactly what happened. You talk to a teacher and you're like, actually, this is how I saw things happen. And until you get that whole story of things, you're never going to really understand what happened and what went down. I think same from a school perspective, and that, something's going on at school that they're seeing consistently, having them call home to say, hey, I saw this today. Did you notice anything weird at home? And maybe then the parents like, oh, well, they didn't sleep at all last night. It was a really rough night. Or Something came up with the family, they didn't get home till late. And, there's things that we have family in town, and that's really throwing off their routine. So just having that communication so everyone can really help support any behaviors is really, really, really important. This is also something I've talked to schools a little bit about, the wizard and lizard brain. Has anyone heard about the wizard and lizard brain? Yeah. So our lizard brain is our sort of fight, flight, freeze response. It's the place that we go when we feel like we're in danger, we're really struggling. Our wizard brain is our higher functioning brain, our executive functioning, the one that helps us think through things and problem solve and reason and all those things. So when you have a child who is heightened and frustrated, and you have a teacher or a parent who is trying to talk them through all that, using so much verbal language, and the child's just getting more and more escalated, more and more frustrated, that is not the time to sit and talk with them because they're in that lizard brain. They're in a fight, flight, or freeze response. So the kid might just run away. They might leave. They might shout out more because they're in this protective mode where they feel like they're threatened per se. So you got to wait to give them that time and that space to be able to sit down and have those conversations. It's just a good reminder because we are also get frustrated when kids do things, so we want to get out our frustration too, and sometimes that's with talking to them or yelling or doing whatever. We give kids space. Usually that helps all of us too. And then says, for a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Just knowing and, that things need to be different for all kids. And there is not, from my experience, one great program that schools provide that helps kids with brain injury because they have these really scattered skills and different ability levels, and every kid looks differently. And so it's not like a child with a learning disability who may be a slow learner, but they can learn in the same sort of developmental process that all the other kids learn. Sometimes they have holes within their learning. So having and expecting them to do the same thing that one of their typical peers could do who hasn't had this type of injury is like asking an elephant to climb a tree. It's just, you're setting them up to fail. It's not going to work. That's okay. Okay. So the other thing I want to make sure we talk about here is these functional behavioral assessments because I think that this is something schools throw out FBAs all the time. And I want to make sure parents are aware of what this is and just kind of give you a little introduction to that. So this is the assessment. You're looking at the ABCs of behavior. And I think the most important thing to remember with behavior is it's a form of communication. There's something that's being communicated with you through their behavior. Whether it's showing you where, what area of executive functioning they're struggling with, or their anxiety or their frustration with things, they are trying to communicate with you through their behaviors. And so when schools look at FBAs, they're looking at, well, first of all, this B, so what's the problem? What does it look like? Oftentimes, you want that to be very specific instead of he has aggressive outbursts. It should be, he kicks and screams when he is going to PE class or whatever it might be. You want it to be very specific so everyone has an idea, knows exactly which behavior you're talking about. Because if you say aggressive outbursts, that could be yelling, that could be throwing something, that could be pushing another student. I mean, there's a range of what people might be thinking. So you want that to be really specific. And then you're talking to help think about interventions. You're thinking about, okay, well, what's happening right before the behavior is happening? So what might be a trigger for this behavior? And then the consequence is what happens after, and not like they're grounded or they're suspended or they would, are they getting attention from their peers? Are they able to avoid the work that was maybe really difficult for them? Are they getting the adult attention that they're just craving from their teacher or maybe from you as a parent? What's happening after? Because what happens after oftentimes is what continues the behavior to go in the cycle because they want whatever they've gotten in that consequence, because now that is being fulfilled for them, something's being fulfilled for them. You want to figure out what is that thing that's being fulfilled for them, and how can we get that to them without this behavior that we don't like. Does that make sense? And then you look at environmental factors. If it's home, you know, what's going on in the home? Is there a visitor? Is grandma in town that really throws them off? Or, you know, were they, you know, earlier that day, did they have a, were they in a loud environment? Were they on a field trip? What other things are happening in the setting? This might also be, are they on certain medications that give, you know, that makes them fatigued or other things? So always looking to the environment and what's going on in the classroom. Is it a loud classroom? Is it a quiet classroom? And then from that, you often get the behavior intervention plan, which you'll hear about in schools too. And these are the strategies. So we know that this is what's happening before, this is the problem behavior, and this is what's happening after. So what are we going to do about it to make sure that behavior doesn't happen, or we're increasing a more positive behavior? So what do we often then start, what do we want to see instead? What would be an ideal situation? So instead of a child getting frustrated and, you know, yelling at you or a teacher or someone, we want them to be able to say, I'm frustrated, and be able to take a break. So if that's what we're aiming for, what do we need to change about what happened before the behavior, and what do we know about why the behavior is happening that we're going to change what happens right after it? So maybe it's a matter of the child's getting frustrated, so he's screaming out, but it's during math, and what's frustrating him is that this math is difficult and he can't get started on it. And so before the behavior would occur, to see a different behavior, we're going to make sure we're going over and we're giving him support during that time in math to help him get started, to break things down. So then hopefully we don't see the frustration and the outburst. And then we can give him whatever he wants. If it's adult attention after, walk over and say, great job, I'm so proud of you. That's wonderful that you did that. So then you can keep, and then you're retraining that behavior. But I think for, you know, parents to at least be aware of, this is kind of the outline of what schools are thinking when they're presented with an FBA or a BIP. And then the setting strategies, where are they seated in the classroom that could make a difference? Things like that are environmental that you can make adjustments to. Are the lights too bright? Can you dim them? Do they need to be in quieter environments for certain types of work? And then with teachers, I talk about this a lot. So sometimes you have to give consequences to behaviors, right? Sometimes they're extreme, and to you know, schools have discipline ladders. They have certain things that they have to follow through with. You as a parent want to make sure consequences are in place too when you see something you don't like in the home. But I would not expect behavior to change from consequences. Oftentimes I tell teachers that, good thing, I'm just asking you to teach more. You teach the skill. So if you look at a behavior of concern, we really want to make difference in that behavior. And what skill do we need to go back and teach? Or what skill do we need to go back and support? Just like we were talking about before, what do we need to change about that environment, about what happens before the behavior to make the difference? But consequences are necessary sometimes, but they can't be the only thing in place for kids, or you won't see the behavior change. And sometimes you get it wrong, like where the issue lies. All of this is trial and error, and that's okay. It's parenting, it's teaching, it's working with kids. Trying something new is always a good thing. The worst thing that you can do is keep doing the same thing over and over again, and you're getting terrible results. As long as you're switching it up and trying something new, you're doing a good job. And then it gets really frustrating because I think a lot of times it's a combination of can they or won't they? Well, sometimes you'll never figure that out. Sometimes it's somewhere in between. Oftentimes it's somewhere in between. But still, if you go back to teaching the skill, you're going to see better outcomes than if you just assume that they can do it, they're just choosing Billy's been in timeout 43 times already this month. It must be working really well. So again, getting to that point that, you know, doing the same thing over and over again. We've all heard what that means. So another big thing I want to just be sure about is that we are supporting the emotional needs of our kids with brain injury. There is a lot of, you know, emotion trying to figure out their new self. And a lot of kids, depending on what time in their life their injury was, have a good recognition of the things they used to be good at and what now they can't do. Or how easy it was to get along with friends and engage with friends, and now it's hard to keep up with a conversation. Sometimes those friends change over that time period because of a lot of these issues that come up. And so we want to be really cautious that even if we think things are going really well, that we always keep a good pulse on how kids are doing emotionally and socially after their injury, because kids with brain injury, adults with brain injury, do have a higher risk of some of these mental health outcomes. And we want to make sure that they're set up so these don't become larger issues for them later on in their life, and even, you know, within the time period that they're in school. So as we sort of wrap up, I'm wondering if anyone is willing to sort of share an experience, or we can even just kind of do a turn and talk with our group's so small here too, that if you would be willing to kind of share something that hit home, or maybe something that you've struggled with that you're still struggling with, or something that you were struggling with that now you feel like you've overcome because you've done something, either with a child in your school or your own child, just something that you feel like is an important part of the recovery from brain injury.
Anybody online willing to share?
Nope.
Well, I'll share. I'm actually a school counselor, and I actually came because I had several kids with concussions, and so I wanted to see them having anxiety to get back to school. So I really wanted to just see how can I help. I know I really get platform. I was going to do like should I do neurofeedback? Let's see, I have nutrition and stuff. But when I'm sitting here, my own personal experience, my son, he's 6 now. He was 8 months old. He had 5 strokes for illness. And so it's very interesting because he's actually a very bright boy, but he was on speech, and this year in kindergarten he lost 19. But his, the neurologist wanted to run tests that he did like the whole battery of, and he's extremely, he's like in superior, exactly what you said, individual spatial, but he was 9% out. And so I went on a field trip with him, and it was just like that. Hey, he would raise his hand. I never knew about that. I didn't know he had that. Because he's afraid he's gonna stutter. Who knows? He doesn't stutter, but he's just afraid he's not gonna get it right. So I mean, totally see that. Like, yeah, he's got 9% on verbal, and he's got 98 in visual spatial. And that's something I really like. Never really thought of it as a brain, right? You know, it's a stroke, and I never thought. He took him off the IEP somehow. And then should I be trying to get him back on?
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things that further down the line, you could start, you know, potentially flipping in some of his literacy skills and things, and the response might be, he's so bright, he can do this, you know, but yeah, maybe there is something bigger there that's really inhibiting him from doing that by himself.
Somebody online says, fatigue has been a big barrier for us in the school setting. We've adjusted to the schedule to allow small breaks, but getting school staff to understand that fatigue is a challenge.
Right, yeah. And there's some of that I have in here too. So there's kind of managing the fatigue is a big in the environment. Sometimes kids, they're
Yeah.
So there's these three kind of hallmarks to brain injury that I talk about, but one of them being fatigue and not being understanding that it might not be just right after an injury. It could be years down the line if they're still having this fatigue issue, and managing that alone could save them and yourself so much frustration. As a parent, if you notice they're coming home and they're just completely wiped at the end of the day, that's something important to communicate back to the school. If the school's noticing that every day at a certain time they are, getting really frustrated or really exhausted and not doing their work, I'd look at that as a time when they're really fatiguing. And then and when I talk to schools, I tell them think of it as a gas tank. That they come in, and sometimes they'll be full when they walk in the door. Sometimes they won't even do that. It'll be half if they had a rough night the night before or whatever might be going on. And that's all you have for the day. You can't refill. So you have to manage whatever that is in that gas tank for that day. And you do that by taking small breaks throughout the day to help them sustain and get through that time. Because once they crash, once they've hit P, they're empty, they're done, and it's really hard to turn them back around, if not impossible. So you really want to set out for the whole day and think of how you can manage that. And you're strategic about it. So if it's a difficult class, it might be a good time to take a break before and or a break after that. If it's a really overwhelming time like recess or lunchroom, something with assembly or something that's really loud, might be a good time to take a break after that rather than expecting them to just be able to go back into class and be able to focus again. Things like that. So the other thing that I kind of touched on too, and you kind of brought up too, is even between skills. This actually being 14, but look at all the range of skills and how it shows up for this child. And making sure people are aware of that. There also might just be unevenness within skill sets of math. Somebody who's really good at can still multiply and divide quite well. They can't add and subtract. And, for people who know about learning, this stuff doesn't make any sense. You need to have the multiplication skill or you need to have the addition skills to be able to learn that multiplication skill. But that's not necessarily the case with our kids with brain injury. So we need to go back and sort of fill in these holes of where they're missing these skills, even though it doesn't make any sense to what we know about learning and development. And then transition to the other big time. So we're coming up to the end of the school year. So thinking about next school year and how that you're going to prepare kids for starting school and how you can sit down with school teams and talk about how the summer went and talk about their schedule. Oftentimes this time of year I'm having meetings with schools and parents to set up schedules and what's going to really work best and being really thoughtful about what that transition looks like and having everyone know it might be a rough start until those routines get set. That's okay. But we all know and we're ready for that. What else can we do to help set this child up to make sure that that's not a big issue? Can they go to the school and practice the walk between the locker and their classes? Can they go to their classroom while the teacher's setting up so they can know them and maybe get a feel for where their desk is before it's surrounded by lots of other kids? So just little things like that we can help ease some of those difficult transitions. So then oftentimes until they get into routine, just switching classes and within the classroom, if things change, if routines change, what you can do to help set them up and prepare them for this change.
Yeah, so I have a girl now that had a concussion, and we've been doing where she comes in for an hour, we were trying to increase it, but she's still throwing up, she's still very sick. So I suggested that she just do 1 hour or if you want a year, not even do it unless her heal and start back up. We're talking like a year, year and a half of school, but I had another situation last year where these kids were not going to school. So it was the fall. So I know we had to increase slowly to get in there, but I feel like with her, when she was here, she really was trying to push the state over to the
Well, how long?
well, it was like multiple. Yeah, so self-esteem, and she slipped. It was like,
Wow. Yeah. I'm sure impact's going to be a lot more.
Still seems blurry, so she gets sick.
Yeah, and is she being followed by a doctor, do you know?
She is. I think we went to children's and the mom was went to her next, they passed her on to the next phase of testing because she's not getting better.
Yeah.
She was seeing double, now she's seeing blurry.
Yeah.
So it's kind of changing, but she's still like throws up if she has to go to school and look at papers. She's wearing glasses.
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of the information we talked about earlier with concussion is talking about a single concussive incident. So when you have these back-to-back, especially sounds like they were in a short amount of time, you're going to see these bigger and more prolonged issues. So yeah, making sure that that's great that they're involved with the medical professionals and hopefully some time over the summer will help with that. But then you'll get a good idea when she comes back to what the physicians are saying to see what she's at that point. Yeah.
And that also as well. It's not that you want to know that it's all that we can ask school. Yeah. For torturing me, it's also like yesterday she was like looking at the sheet. I didn't. I was really compromised where because my goal is to keep in schools. And since we ended up doing something great, I feel like is there kind of a compromise maybe relationship between you and the school or agency time so that you can access their friends and play with school and the end of the school and then just doing that and if expectations right now because other videos as well that you know that kids need that might be the key, you like the parents wanting homework and stuff at home. Yeah. I mean, it is possible to kind of see yourself as being the studio of things like that, and say, okay, what's the best fit for that, and do really well, and so you've got to speak. But then how it comes that you can use the system as possible and the school working. That's another thing, because if you can get from her when testing, so her teacher is going to put ends on her grade, because she's only first grade. And so I said, well, I need to document and report my information because I just think it's not really fair that she incorporate that in documentation.
Right. Yeah, and I think you definitely wanted to stop and see if a teacher can evaluate where they would be.
Like in the last semester. Right?
Yeah, yeah, or whenever, right before the injury ended. I mean, teachers are taking data all the time on kids' skills, even in first grade. Are constantly taking data on their reading and writing and math skills and have enough that you think that they could kind of document where she was at prior to that. But thank you for sharing that, Rachel. Yeah, what can you really cut back on this? And it's, I mean, it's the end of the year.
I was like,
Everybody's
Sometimes
tired
you're
and burned out and just give her a break, Get to that point.
I
too.
guess I didn't think about the social piece and all the stuff, but
Yeah.
so, yeah, like so like her connected. But again, like I think the assembly.
There might be, depending on, I think they're pretty overstimulating environments and they're loud and they get really excited and this is just a very busy, hyped up time in the school year and in schools anyway. The energy level is high. So yeah, it might be too much for her. And yeah, homework seems a little, a lot of that. So I just want to show you these resources here. This is Help Kids with Brain Injury. This has a very similar thing to what the manual has for CDE, which is also in the website too. But this has a link for parents, a link for educators. What's great about it too is you can go in and you can kind of find, like, I think they're struggling with, from the educator's side, attention, and it'll say, this is what you'll see in the classroom, here are intervention ideas. So it lists a ton of those things. So with parents, here's what I see at home, here's what the behaviors look like, what would that potentially mean? Well, maybe that means that they have trouble initiating a task. Well, here's some things that you can do there. So it gives you just much more resources for both people. And then this is the Brain Injury Manual that we're actually revising currently and should have a new one out, I think, or maybe even before the beginning of the school year. But again, if you Google CDE TBI, this will come up. There's also a big push right now by CDE to do training for school professionals on brain injury through brain steps. So they're training districts to have these consultative teams that are multiple disciplines within the school. So it could be nurse, counselors, social workers, psychologists, special ed teachers, administrators, whoever it might be. And they're all volunteer teams, but they're getting trained on brain injury and then how they can support the schools in their district to make sure that there's some more internal district support too going on. And they'll have training throughout the year for those districts. So if you're curious to see if your district has those, feel free to email me and I can help you figure out who that person could be and that contact could be. And if you're interested in having your district be a part of that, reach out to some of the maybe teachers at the school, whoever it might be, to get them, see if they're going to be involved, because they might not be aware that this is happening. So that's it for me. Any other questions?
The only other thing I was going to say as a resource, we have a page on our website that's all about concussion management that we developed in partnership with Children's Hospital and Rocky Mountain Hospital for Children. I'm going to pull it up right now so you guys can see it. Just give me a second.
There's also the website Get Schooled on Concussion. It's specific to school-related concerns. GetSchooledOnConcussions.com. It's all one word.
So it's just our website /concussion-protocol. And it goes through kind of what happens, like each step. And then there are sections on like returning to school, and there are some resources. Some home instructions to consider, and you can click on different resources. So, and this is, a lot of the stuff on the left is what medical providers go through, but it's still probably helpful for any of you that are working with concussion. So.
Obviously, these organizations don't need to Colorado. No, I'm using it in the States. I was wondering if there like national affiliates that have similar efforts, or just is Colorado promoting forefront role this, or?
Colorado is pretty progressive, I think, when it comes to brain injury. We are one of the few states who even has a brain injury specialist within our Department of Education. But there are some other great resources that are put out from other states too. Pennsylvania, the CDE stole the brain steps idea from and are transitioning that to what it looks like in Colorado. They have some great resources. Oregon and Washington have great resources too. I think there's a lot out there. It's just a matter of looking around. But yeah, there's lots of other states that have great things. We like to think Colorado has some wonderful resources as well. But.
I love
Yeah. Yeah. And the great thing about it is it doesn't, to use it, you don't have to necessarily be working with a child with a brain injury, It could be, for any sort of concern you have or just intervention ideas. Just doesn't mean they just are helpful for kids with brain injury either.
Are there any other questions from folks online? Feel free to say them out loud if your audio is working, or type them in the chat box. You know, like some of your graphics.